the Glenn Beck program special on the Blaze television network had been promoted as no-holds-barred examination of what Beck characterized as the Democratic Party's weaponization of congressional power through aggressive investigations that he argued represented existential threat to constitutional governance and to the separation of powers principles that the framers had carefully designed to prevent any single branch from dominating the others, in ways that Beck's libertarian conservative philosophy viewed as inevitably leading toward tyranny, regardless of whether those wielding concentrated power claimed to be motivated by noble accountability purposes. Glenn Beck sat in his signature studio setup, surrounded by chalkboards covered with intricate diagrams, connecting various political figures and constitutional concepts in ways that his devoted audience found illuminating, and that his critics, characterized as conspiratorial thinking, dressed up as intellectual analysis. His presentation style, combining emotional intensity with appeals to founding principles and historical parallels that ranged from American Revolution to various authoritarian regimes that Beck argued shared characteristics with contemporary American progressive governance that his audience should recognize as dangerous warning signs. Jasmine Crockett had been invited to appear on Beck's program in what his producers had structured as confrontational interview format, where Beck would challenge her congressional oversight advocacy through combination of constitutional arguments, historical analysis, and the kind of passionate rhetorical questioning that had made him one of conservative media's most influential voices, despite, or perhaps because, of his willingness to make provocative claims that mainstream media would consider beyond acceptable discourse boundaries, but that Beck's audience valued as evidence that he was willing to speak uncomfortable truths that establishment figures on both left and right wanted suppressed. The interview had been proceeding through Beck's characteristic questioning style, combining constitutional references with emotional appeals about threats to American liberty. When he had begun building toward what his longtime viewers recognized as one of his signature rhetorical crescendos, where he would present what he believed was devastating critique of his guests' positions, delivered with such passionate conviction that the emotional force would overwhelm rational response, his approach reflecting broadcast style that prioritized visceral impact over careful analytical precision in ways that his supporters viewed as authentic communication, and that his critics characterized as manipulative demagoguery designed to inflame rather than inform. Then Glenn Beck had done something that would define the interview and ultimately backfire. Catastrophically after, Crockett had explained her constitutional framework for congressional oversight authority. Beck had begun laughing at her response, in ways that were clearly designed to mock her positions as naive or absurd. His laughter, theatrical and condescending as he suggested to his audience that what she had just articulated was so disconnected from constitutional reality and from what the founders actually intended that it deserved ridicule rather than serious engagement. The mockery delivered with Beck's characteristic emotional intensity and with apparent confidence that his audience would share his view that Crockett's advocacy represented the kind of governmental overreach that true patriots should recognize as dangerous and should oppose through the same passionate commitment that Beck modeled through his programming. What Glenn Beck had catastrophically miscalculated was that Crockett had been anticipating exactly this kind of theatrical, dismissive mockery and had prepared a response, so comprehensive in its demonstration that Beck's own show had celebrated. Congressional investigations when they targeted Democrats, so devastating in its exposure that Beck's constitutional principles seemed to reverse, based entirely on partisan considerations rather than remaining consistent across administrations. So precise in quoting from Beck's own past programs where he had advocated for aggressive oversight that contradicted everything his current laughter was suggesting about constitutional limits on investigations, and so calmly delivered, despite his theatrical mockery, that when she finished her response, Beck would be left literally speechless, not with quick comeback or emotional escalation, but with genuine inability to formulate any coherent response that wouldn't require him to either acknowledge the hypocrisy she had exposed or attempt to defend position reversals that even his own audience would recognize as undermining his claims about principled constitutional philosophy. If you want to see what happens when conservative media personality laughs at congressional members' constitutional advocacy, thinking theatrical mockery will substitute for substantive argument, and that mockery triggers response so comprehensive. Improving the mocker's own positions have reversed, based on partisan calculations, that it leaves him unable to speak. Subscribe to this channel immediately, because we are going to examine every element of how Crockett's response left Beck speechless, and why this moment became legendary for demonstrating that theatrical mockery cannot withstand systematic exposure of the mocker's own inconsistent positions that prove their constitutional principles are selectively applied based on which party is being investigated. Beck's mocking laughter at Crockett had come after she had spent several minutes explaining the constitutional framework supporting congressional investigatory authority. Beck had been listening with increasingly skeptical expressions when he had interrupted her with laughter. Beck had said while laughing, I'm sorry. I have to stop you." Because he had continued laughing, "This is just Representative Crockett. Do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you're advocating for? You're essentially saying, Congress can investigate anything, anyone, for any reason, as long as they claim it might relate to legislation." He had gestured dramatically to his chalkboards. The founders would be rolling in their graves. They created limited government with enumerated powers specifically to prevent exactly what you're describing, and you're sitting here advocating for unlimited congressional investigatory authority wrapped in constitutional language, as if citing a few Supreme Court cases makes it legitimate. His laughter had continued, clearly designed to signal to his audience that Crockett's positions were so absurd they deserved mockery rather than serious engagement. Beck had then delivered what he clearly believed would be his devastating rhetorical flourish. This is exactly why the American people are losing faith in their institutions. Because elected officials like you come on programs like this and advocate for governmental power that the Constitution never granted, that the founders never intended, that represents everything they fought a revolution to prevent. And you do it with a straight face, as if you're defending democracy when you're actually describing tyranny. The Glenn Beck program audience had applauded his passionate denunciation, clearly appreciating what they viewed as his forceful defense of constitutional principles against governmental overreach. But what happened next would leave Beck speechless. Crockett had remained completely calm during Beck's theatrical laughter and passionate rhetoric, and when she responded, her tone was measured and her words were devastating. Crockett had begun, "Mr. Beck, thank you for that passionate response. But before we continue, I want to address something that I think your audience deserves to understand. Because your laughter at my constitutional advocacy and your suggestion that I'm advocating for tyrannical governmental power reveals something important about how your principles seem to shift based on partisan considerations." Beck's laughter had stopped, his expression shifting to uncertainty as he apparently began to recognize that Crockett was about to say something he hadn't anticipated. Crockett had continued, "Mr. Beck, in 2013 and 2014, when Republicans were investigating the Obama administration's handling of Benghazi, Fast and Furious, the IRS targeting controversy, and numerous other matters, you devoted extensive programming to supporting those investigations. You argued that congressional oversight was a central accountability mechanism, that Congress had constitutional authority and responsibility to investigate executive branch conduct, that demanding documents and testimony was legitimate exercise of congressional power." She had pulled out her tablet showing clips. "I have footage from your show where you advocated for aggressive congressional investigations of the Obama administration. On May 8, 2013, discussing IRS targeting, you said, and, I'm quoting you, directly, Congress has every right and every responsibility to investigate this. This is exactly what congressional oversight is supposed to be, holding the executive branch accountable when there's evidence of wrongdoing. The founders gave Congress investigatory authority for precisely this purpose." Beck's confident expression had evaporated, replaced by visible discomfort as he recognized that Crockett had comprehensive documentation of his own past advocacy for congressional oversight. Crockett had continued her systematic breakdown. "On October 10, 2013, discussing Benghazi investigations, you said congressional subpoenas must be enforced. When the executive branch refuses to comply with legitimate oversight, Congress has constitutional authority to compel compliance. That separation of powers, Congress checks the executive through investigations. And courts enforce congressional subpoenas when executives refuse cooperation. That's the exact constitutional framework I just articulated that you were laughing at. You advocated for it when Republicans were investigating a Democratic administration, but now the Democrats are investigating a Republican administration using the same constitutional framework. You're laughing and characterizing it as tyranny. She had then delivered her most devastating point. Let me show you one more example. On November 3, 2014, you discussed congressional oversight broadly and said, "The founders understood that power corrupts. That's why they gave Congress broad oversight authority to investigate executive conduct. We can't have accountability without investigation. And we can't have investigation without subpoena power that courts will enforce." Anyone who argues that congressional investigations represent overreach fundamentally misunderstands constitutional structure. Mr. Beck, you just laughed at me for advocating that Congress has broad investigatory authority necessary for accountability. But in 2014, you said anyone who argues congressional investigations represent overreach fundamentally misunderstands constitutional structure. So by your own 2014 standard, your 2025 laughter at my advocacy for congressional oversight represents fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional structure. The Glenn Beck program studio had fallen into complete silence. Beck sat frozen, clearly unable to formulate any response. His theatrical confidence had been replaced by visible recognition that Crockett had comprehensively documented that his positions on congressional oversight had reversed entirely based on which party was conducting investigations. Crockett had concluded. So, Mr. Beck, your laughter at my constitutional advocacy wasn't based on principled application of founding principles that remain consistent regardless of which party exercises power. Your laughter was based on the fact that Democrats are currently exercising the same oversight authority that you championed when Republicans exercised it against Obama. That's not constitutional principle. That's partisan hypocrisy. And I think your audience deserves to know that when you laugh at congressional oversight as tyranny, you're contradicting your own previous advocacy for that same oversight when it served your political preferences. The founders you invoked wouldn't be rolling in their graves at congressional oversight. Created congressional oversight, but they might be troubled by media figures who advocate for governmental authority when their preferred party wields it, and then mock that same authority as tyranny when the other party wields it. Because that kind of unprincipled partisan positioning is exactly the faction-driven politics they warned against. The Glenn Beck program studio remained in absolute stunned silence. Beck sat completely speechless, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to formulate response, but unable to produce any words. His typical rapid-fire emotional rhetoric had abandoned him entirely as he processed that Crockett had used his own words from his own show to prove his positions had reversed, based purely on partisan considerations. After approximately 10 seconds of complete silence and eternity in television, Beck finally attempted to respond. Those situations were different because Obama was actually violating, but Crockett had immediately interrupted. Mr. Beck, if those situations were constitutionally different, then you would have explained those differences in your past advocacy. But you didn't. You advocated for congressional oversight using the exact same constitutional framework I use today. You said Congress has broad authority to investigate executive conduct, that subpoenas must be enforced, that this is what the founders intended. Those are general constitutional principles that don't change based on who's president. If you want to argue now that Obama-era investigations were legitimate, while Trump-era investigations are tyranny, you need to articulate a constitutional principle that distinguishes them beyond just "I agreed with investigating Obama, but disagree with investigating Trump," because without that principle, your laughter at my advocacy reveals not my constitutional error, but your partisan inconsistency. Beck had no response. He sat speechless for several more seconds before finally saying, "We need to take a commercial break." The commercial break had lasted longer than scheduled, with Beck's producers apparently scrambling to determine how to proceed after their host had been left speechless by guests' systematic documentation of his inconsistent positions. When the interview resumed after the break, Beck's energy was noticeably subdued. He asked Crockett a few more questions, but his typical passionate intensity had been replaced by cautious engagement, apparently recognizing that further theatrical mockery would invite additional exposure of his position. Reversals. The immediate aftermath focused entirely on how Crockett had left Beck speechless by proving through his own past programming that his constitutional positions had reversed based on partisan considerations. Conservative media figures struggled to defend Beck, given that Crockett had quoted his own words advocating for the congressional oversight he was now mocking as tyranny. Social media reactions to the exchange were extraordinary. Clips showing Beck's theatrical laughter, followed by his complete speechlessness after Crockett's response, went massively viral, with over 60 million views. Within 48 hours, across platforms, the viral spread reflected several factors. First, seeing Glenn Beck, known for his passionate rhetoric and emotional intent, rendered completely speechless, was satisfying reversal. Second, Crockett's use of Beck's own past statements was devastating because it proved inconsistency through his own words rather than through external criticism. Third, the contrast between Beck's theatrical mockery and Crockett's calm systematic documentation created compelling television. Fourth, the exchange appealed across political lines, because even conservatives who agreed with Beck's policy positions could recognize that his positions on oversight had reversed. Based on partisan calculations, the Blaze faced internal discussions about the interview, with some producers acknowledging that Beck's theatrical mockery had backfired by creating opening for Crockett to expose inconsistencies that undermined his credibility. Several noted that better preparation might have anticipated that Crockett would have researched Beck's past positions. For Glenn Beck personally, being left speechless by guests who proved his positions had reversed was damaging to his brand as consistent, principled voice for constitutional conservatism. His inability to formulate coherent response beyond attempting weak distinction that Crockett immediately refuted demonstrated that the inconsistency was indefensible. Beck addressed the interview in subsequent programs, attempting to argue that context distinguished his Obama-era support for oversight from his current opposition. But these attempts at reconciliation were widely viewed as stock rationalization rather than as genuine principled distinction, particularly since his original advocacy for oversight had used general constitutional principles that he hadn't limited to specific contexts. Conservative commentators who valued intellectual consistency over partisan positioning acknowledged that Crockett had identified genuine problem with Beck's advocacy that his constitutional positions on oversight appeared to track his political preferences rather than remaining consistent across administrations. For Crockett, leaving Beck speechless through his own past statements demonstrated the value of comprehensive research into critics' previous positions to identify inconsistencies that could be exploited when they deployed theatrical mockery. In subsequent interviews, Crockett explained that she had prepared for Beck's program by watching extensive footage of his Obama-era programming, specifically because she anticipated he would mock congressional oversight as overreach. Despite having previously supported it when Republicans controlled oversight, she had compiled specific quotes where he had advocated for the same oversight framework he would likely attack. Preparing to deploy those quotes if he gave her the opening, she emphasized that Beck's theatrical laughter had been perfect opening because it positioned him as dismissing constitutional principles he had previously championed, making the contrast between his past and present positions impossible to miss when she presented the documentation. So, if this examination of how theatrical mockery can backfire when the mocker's own past statements prove their positions have reversed, based on partisan considerations, has shown you why. Consistency in constitutional principles requires maintaining positions across changes in political control, and why comprehensive research into critics' past advocacy can provide devastating responses to theatrical dismissal. Subscribe to this channel for continued analysis of moments when mockery meets documentation of inconsistency. The Glenn Beck program interview, where Glenn Beck laughed at Jasmine Crockett and her response left him speechless, was more than satisfying. Confrontation it was demonstration that theatrical mockery cannot withstand systematic exposure of the mockers' own reversed positions, proving their constitutional principles are selectively applied based on whose conduct is investigated. That passion and intensity cannot substitute for consistency when advocates' own past statements contradict their current advocacy, and that's sometimes the most effective. Responses to dismissive laughter are calm presentations of documentation proving that laugher has advocated for exactly what they're now mocking as tyranny when different. Party wielded the same authority they previously championed.